So let's talk about critical thinking skills. In your brief guide to critical thinking, we will review some of the basics for good critical thinking and the expectations that come with that. Critical thinking is central to doing philosophy. One way to think about this is that, look, we're going to be studying a lot of very interesting ideas and concepts and various ways to reflect on them. Anyone out on the street, though, can have an interesting idea, a strange concept, but that doesn't make it worth studying as philosophy. What really sets philosophy aside as special, as interesting, as worth study is that these philosophers have taken the time to defend the ideas and their way of looking at the world. That is, they've taken the time to give justification and argument to demonstrate why their idea is the right way to look at things. Now, these arguments and justifications follow certain rules, certain standard expectations for what makes for a good argument and what makes for a bad argument. And we would be well served to spend the next couple of weeks studying how good critical thinking skills manifest themselves within sound reasoning. If you will turn to your textbook, to page 5 in your critical thinking guide, what we are going to be studying is often revealed through the study of logic. Logic is a subdiscipline of philosophy. Logic studies the way that we reason to draw conclusions. That is, the way we reflect in order to better understand. Critical thinking is the exercise of these expectations for good reasoning. Critical thinking is what we do when we think through and reason to an appropriate understanding of something. Critical thinking is the application of the rules of reasoning on which our judgments and understanding rely. Now, it's important to note, as your textbook does, that reason is universal. There are no different ways to reason. There are no different ways of thinking. Human beings all reason the same way. Thus, the standards that we will be reviewing are applicable to all, and we can hold everyone accountable to those standards. Now, critical thinking has some very concrete utility. That is, some very practical application. We use critical thinking to resolve conflicts, to solve and analyze problems, and when practiced, especially within the study of philosophy, for the discovery of truth, or at least as close as we can come to it. The primary vehicle by which we critically think is through argument. When we give an argument, critical thinking is all we're doing. We're not counting. We're not having an aesthetic experience, such as listening to music. We're not expressing an emotion. We're not simply describing. In argument, we are expressing a critical judgment based on sound reason. So what is an argument? An argument consists of a position supported by reasons. That's all. It's not an emotional outburst. It's not two people engaged in contrary positions. An argument is merely a position, a point of view supported by reason, supported by justification for holding that view. Again, as I said earlier, this is the way in which we expect philosophers worthy of study, to present their ideas. That is, we expect of a philosopher that he or she will support their view with sound reasoning. Warranting connectives. Warranting connectives are those words and phrases that we use to indicate whether we have a position or a reason, the two parts of an argument. Now, it's worth noting warranting connectives for two reasons. First of all, when a warranting connective is being used, we know that we are being given an argument, since that's all warranting connectives do. They mark out the parts of an argument. They show us how an argument is supposed to be understood. The other important aspect of warranting connectives is they're showing us the parts of an argument. Thus, we have two kinds of warranting connectives. We have premise indicators, words like because, since, and for. Now, the word because is our preeminent premise indicator. Its only job in our language is to say, here is a reason in an argument. That's all it does. So when you see the word because, you know that someone is attempting to give you a reason, a justification for believing something. Of course, the other part of the argument is the position, or what we sometimes refer to as the conclusion, to be drawn from the reasons given. And thus we have conclusion markers. Words like therefore, thus, so, in conclusion. Therefore is our preeminent conclusion indicator. When we see the word therefore, we know that someone is showing us what they want us to believe. They are telling us, here's the point of the reasons I just gave. This is where the reasons I just gave you are supposed to take you. That's the word therefore's only job in our language. Now, other words that work as premise indicators and conclusion indicators serve other purposes as well. The word since, for example, is a premise indicator, but it can also mark a progression of events. Since it rained yesterday, the road has been muddy. Words like so often work as indexicals. Now, there are other kinds of words and phrases, statements, that contribute to structuring an argument, such as conditional statements, if-then statements. Conditional statements, while they are not true warranting connectives, because not every conditional statement actually marks out an argument. They often do set the pattern for an argument, and they are worth noting because frequently when we are reading philosophy, for example, if we see a conditional statement, that is, should the words if and then be used, that often tells us that the writer is structuring an argument for us. And we'll have time a little later to look at examples of how if-then can structure arguments. Which brings us to the first standard for good reasoning. An argument must be sound in order to be a good, convincing argument. The word sound or soundness has a particular meaning in logic. That is, in logic, when we refer to an argument as sound, we are saying it ought to convince. That is, it meets all of the expectations to be a good, convincing argument. So that's the goal. When we give an argument, when we justify what we believe, we are in the business of giving a sound argument. Soundness can be defined as a valid argument with true premises. That is, an argument has to have a correct structure to it. It has to have the right form. And, unsurprisingly, it has to be telling the truth in order to meet the expectations of a sound, that is, a convincing argument. Soundness is the standard for all arguments, not just philosophical arguments. It doesn't matter the subject. Our goal should always be to provide a sound justification for our point of view or for what we are trying to prove to someone. Let's look at validity. Validity is the more unfamiliar expectation for an argument. We're used to questions of truth, and in fact, in a very important sense, we'll be spending this semester worrying about questions of truth. Truth, as it turns out, is a challenging conversation, a challenging evaluation. So let's set aside for now the expectation for telling the truth in an argument and just focus on the more unfamiliar part of that, and that is validity. Validity speaks to the deductive part of the argument. Validity can be defined as an argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. That is, to say of an argument that it is valid is to say that should the premises turn out to be true, should it be the case that the arguer is telling the truth, then the conclusion must also be true. That's the mark of a valid argument. One way to think about it is a valid argument forces the conclusion if the premises are true. That is, the listener or reader has no other option but to agree to the conclusion if the premises are true and the argument is valid. Well, the listener or reader does have one other option, and that is to simply be unreasonable. But that's not what philosophy does. It's worth noting that this definition, that validity itself, is about the form of the argument. We speak about the form of the argument because there are certain ways to structure our presentation of our reasons such that the reasons themselves connect in order to eventually take us to that one and only one conclusion. Now, it's also worth noting that validity is conceptual, which means that it's a matter of definition. That is, an argument either meets the definition of validity or it doesn't. There's no almost valid argument. An argument can't be a little bit valid. Either the argument is valid or it isn't. And so in that sense, once we get used to our definition of validity, validity turns out to be the easier determination to make when evaluating someone's argument because it's a black and white matter. Either it meets our definition of validity or it doesn't. We don't have to worry about any kind of gray area that may or may not deliver validity because it is a matter of definition. So let's try out our definition of validity. And these examples can be found on page 8 of your textbook. First example, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Is that valid? Well, no. It's not valid because I can believe that all men are mortal, but I haven't said anything about Socrates, and therefore my reasons don't force me to conclude that Socrates is mortal. Socrates may not be a human. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This too is an invalid argument because I haven't said anything about the disposition of humans. That is, I can believe that Socrates is a man, but that does not force me to conclude that Socrates is mortal. Perhaps not all men are mortal. We haven't spoken to that question. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is a valid argument. And in fact, this is our quintessential example of a valid argument. Thank you, Aristotle. Consider this. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. Let's assume for the moment that both of those statements are true. Now ask yourself, is there any way that you can deny that Socrates is mortal? Well, if you deny that Socrates is mortal, then it must be because either it's not true that all men are mortal, or it's not true that Socrates is a man. That is, the truth of the premises forces the truth of the conclusion, which is exactly what we want from our valid arguments. After all, what's the point in giving an argument if after you've done your job, after you have given a sound argument, the reader or listener reasonably can still reject it? What was the point of doing it in the first place if a reasonable person can still reject it when you did what you were supposed to do within the argument. So, of course, our central expectation of a valid argument is that if all of the reasons are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. All men are mortal. Socrates is mortal. Therefore, Socrates is a man. This is invalid because we can believe that all men are mortal. We can believe that Socrates is mortal, but that doesn't force us to believe that Socrates is a man. Socrates could be my cat. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. Therefore, all men are mortal. Again, this is an invalid argument. After all, I can believe that Socrates is a man, and I can believe that Socrates is mortal. But that doesn't force me to believe all men are mortal. It could be that Socrates, and perhaps a handful of others, are the only ones who are mortal. The reasons given in the argument simply don't force me to believe the conclusion. Now, as I said earlier, conditional statements, if-then statements, often set the pattern for an argument. In this case, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Note how the if-then statement sets up a pattern that, when followed and followed correctly, delivers a valid argument. Consider for yourself whether you can still reject the conclusion Socrates is mortal if you believe the two reasons given in this argument. And we'll have more to say about this particular kind of argument. So, what's the central question that we want to ask when determining validity? Can we imagine in any way that the premises are true and still believe that the conclusion could be false? If we answer yes to that question, then the argument cannot be valid. On the other hand, if we answer no to the question, that there's simply no way for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, then we have a valid argument. And again, I can't stress enough the power of this definition of validity, the power of this deductive concept. What this tells us is, if we give a valid argument, and who's ever reading it believes everything we say in it, no matter how emotionally upsetting if the conclusion may be, as a reasonable person, the reader must accept the conclusion as true. That is a powerful process for moving along our analyses of problems and our investigations into truth. I leave it to you to work the exercise in the text. Please keep in mind that the exercises do have an answer guide in the back to help you determine whether or not you have done the exercises appropriately. These will help you to prepare for the upcoming exercises in the modules. I'll leave it to you to go on and work those, and when we come back, we will continue with our discussion. Now that you've had a chance to work on those videos, that is on those exercises, let's go ahead and look at some characteristics of these of this logical experiment here. If I can get to it. All right, moving on to our standard argument forms. As it turns out, there are some common structures for valid arguments that we have identified over the years that we know always provide for validity. And it's useful if we have in mind just a handful of those standard argument forms. This is just a handful. There are many standard valid forms of reasoning identified, but these are a couple or so of the most often used. The first is modus ponens. If A, then B, A, so B. This is the structure of the argument that we looked at earlier. If Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is always a valid argument, and the point of these argument forms is you can take any two propositions, put them in place of A and B, and as long as you follow the pattern, you will have a valid argument. That is also the case with so-called modus tollens. If A, then B, not B, so not A. Again, you can put anything that is a proposition, that is any subject predicate statement in place of A and B, and you will always have a valid argument when you follow this pattern. So, if it rains, then I'll bring an umbrella. I didn't bring an umbrella, so it's not raining. Again, because I followed the modus tollens pattern, we know this to be a valid argument. Hypothetical syllogism. If A, then B. If B, then C. So if A, then C. Now what's important about the hypothetical syllogism is it is an open-ended argument for the number of propositions that one can use. That is, there's no limit to the number of propositions that we can put in the hypothetical syllogism format as long as we stay with the pattern. So we can keep going. For example, if A, then B, if B, then C, if C, then E, then D, if D, then E, if E, then F, if F, then G, if G, then H. Therefore, if A, then H. The point is that unlike modus ponens and modus tollens, this is an open-ended form of reasoning. And then the disjunctive syllogism, either A or B, not A, so B. And the important part of the disjunctive syllogism, as we'll see, is that when we have a disjunction, A or B, as long as we deny one side, A or B, as long as we deny one of those in the premises, we can always conclude the other side so that we could say either A or B, not B, so A. It doesn't matter which side of the disjunction one denies, as long as the denial is in the premises, not in the conclusion. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. And then, of course, we have our categorical syllogisms. Again, it's important to remember that this is just a handful of the identified patterns of validity. I strongly encourage the student to take a formal logic class to identify more of such patterns for valid argument. I've also in the text identified a couple of formal fallacies, that is, errors in reasoning that are frequently made when people don't pay attention in creating their arguments. The first is affirming the consequent. If A, then B, B, so A. That cannot lead to a valid argument. If it rains, then I'll bring an umbrella. I brought an umbrella, so it must be raining. It doesn't take much reflection to understand why this is not a valid argument, because after all, when I say, if it rains, then I'll bring an umbrella. Well, just because I brought an umbrella doesn't necessitate that it's raining, because I haven't suggested that if it's raining is the only reason I would bring an umbrella. I've simply stated that if it is raining, I'll bring an umbrella, but I might have other reasons for bringing an umbrella as well. Another formal fallacy, denying the antecedent. If A, then B, not A, so not B. If it rains, then I'll bring an umbrella. It's not raining, so I didn't bring an umbrella. Again, this is not a valid argument. After all, again, if it rains, then I'll bring an umbrella does not suggest that raining is the only time that I would bring an umbrella. I could bring an umbrella for other reasons as well. So just because it's not raining doesn't rule out the possibility that I would still bring an umbrella. And finally, the disjunctive fallacy. Again, I talked about it earlier, either A or B, A, so not B. It's generally an error in reasoning to think that just because we affirm one side of a disjunction, that we must deny the other side. Frequently, when we use the word or, we mean that we could have one or the other or both. And that is why it's a fallacy to say A or B, A, so it cannot be B. That is a fallacy of reasoning. And I invite you to again go to work exercises 3 and 4 in your textbook. And again, there are answer keys in the back that can help you understand what you got wrong and why. I hope this very, very brief foray into formal reasoning has given you some idea as to how formal reasoning works and what those expectations are. Again, if you are interested in learning more about logic and its application to various forms of reasoning, I strongly encourage you to take a standalone 16-week logic class, such as our introductory logic class here at Butler